Since 2021, Africa has experienced 13 military coups and coup attempts. All but one happened in the Sahel and West Africa, predominantly former French colonies. That concentration demands explanation. Most global terrorism no longer centers in Afghanistan or Iraq. It's concentrated in Africa's Sahel region, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. The same countries experiencing this coup wave. Political scientists have started calling these events Coupvolutions, coups driven by popular protest rather than elite power struggles. Today, I'm examining 3 myths that obscure what's actually driving this crisis. Not to pick sides, but to understand the pattern. Here's the standard narrative. French colonial rule, despite its problems, built infrastructure and institutions that benefited African development. France's continued involvement maintains that constructive relationship. Let me show you what happened when one country tested that narrative. In 1958, French colonies faced a choice: join the new French community or vote for immediate independence. Only Guinea, under Sékou Touré, voted no. France's response was immediate. They withdrew military support, administrative staff, infrastructure, telephones, light bulbs, medical supplies, but declassified documents reveal something more calculated. French intelligence launched Operation Persil. They used government printing presses to mass-produce counterfeit Guinean currency and flood Guinea's economy with fake money. Maurice Robert, who directed this operation, later described it. The operation was a total success. Guinea's economy, already very weak, never fully recovered. Now, Robert claimed this wasn't punishment for Guinea's independence vote. He said it was necessary Cold War strategy, preventing the Soviet bloc, which was interested in Guinea's mineral resources, from gaining a bridgehead for the spread of subversion. But here's what matters. Whatever the stated motive, the effect was economic collapse, currency depreciation, soaring prices, and French Prime Minister Georges Pompidou used Guinea as an explicit warning to other African countries considering leaving the French monetary system. Let the experience of Sékou Touré take its course. Many Africans are beginning to realize that Guinea's policy is suicidal and contrary to the interests of Africa. That brings us to the system that replaced direct colonial control, the CFA franc. 14 African countries still use this currency today. Communauté financière africaine, African Financial Community. These countries must deposit substantial portions of their foreign exchange reserves with the French treasury, a requirement that continues for Central African nations. France effectively controls monetary policy for these countries, setting interest rates, managing reserves, maintaining fixed exchange rates with the euro. Now, the system has defenders. President Alassane Ouattara of Côte d'Ivoire, former governor of the regional central bank, argues CFA countries are better off than Anglophone countries because of this stability. He points to inflation rates. Côte d'Ivoire averaged 6% inflation, compared to Ghana's 29%. Ouattara claims the CFA franc has fostered the most continuous growth in the long term. French officials echo this. Economic Minister Michel Sapin described the arrangement as France acting in a completely disinterested manner out of pure friendship, guaranteeing unlimited convertibility to prevent currency collapse. But critics, including a growing number of African economists, argue those benefits mask structural problems. The fixed exchange rate creates what they call low competitiveness. It makes African exports more expensive while making imports from Europe cheaper. That undermines local manufacturing and agriculture. And the resource extraction patterns reveal whose interests the system prioritizes. Niger's uranium, for example, provides significant fuel for France's nuclear reactors, which generate 75% of France's electricity. Yet Niger's royalties remain notably lower than what the same French companies pay in other uranium-producing countries. A 2019 Afrobarometer poll found that Togolese citizens were overwhelmingly in favor of leaving the CFA franc, reflecting a widespread belief that the currency primarily serves French interests rather than African development. So the question isn't whether the CFA franc provides some stability. It does. But the question is, stability for whom and at what cost? The second myth, French military operations in Mali serve as necessary stabilizing forces preventing terrorist expansion and state collapse. Let's examine the evidence. In 2013, armed groups seized towns across northern Mali. France deployed Operation Serval, 5,000 troops, air support, advanced military technology. The mission: eliminate terrorist threats and restore stability. A decade later, Mali's prime minister described the outcome. Hundreds and hundreds of Malians have been massacred over the years, despite the presence of over 50,000 soldiers. By 2021, the region experienced over 2,500 violent incidents and nearly 6,000 deaths. Violence didn't just continue, it spread from Mali into Niger and Burkina Faso during French military deployment. Academic analysis concludes the strategy was doomed to fail because it prioritized killing militants over addressing why people join militant groups in the first place. Economic inequality, governance failures, ethnic grievances. French tactical decisions made this worse. To fight terrorist groups, French forces collaborated with local militias. Some committed atrocities against civilian communities. That drove civilians to join armed groups for protection from the very militias France supported. Even French analysts recognized this. Internal assessments noted that unilateral interventions fuel anti-French sentiment, undermining France's regional influence. So if French presence provided stability, why did violence increase and spread? And why did Mali's democratic government collapse under military rule while French forces remained deployed? The evidence suggests the intervention created conditions for the instability it claimed to prevent. Standard analysis treats each military takeover as isolated domestic failure, corrupt officials, weak institutions, poor leadership. But watch the pattern. Mali terminated defense agreements with France, expelled the French ambassador, demanded withdrawal of French troops. Burkina Faso did the same. Then Niger. All three suspended economic agreements with Paris and shifted towards Russia, Turkey, or China. That's not three isolated events. That's coordination. The military leaders explicitly used anti-French sentiment to justify their takeovers and build popular support. Research on these coups identifies anti-French sentiment as the fundamental factor contributing to the recent spike in coups d'etats, finding that one of the main triggers for opposition protests is French presence in the country. Now, we need to be very clear about what these military governments have actually delivered. In Mali, the pivot towards cooperation with Russia's Wagner group has seen increased violence against civilians and little counterinsurgency impact. In Burkina Faso, the Couplition raises a fundamental question. Security analysts note it remains unclear how or if this can improve the human security situation. How likely is it that the same army, the same military leadership will be more successful fighting armed groups now than they were before the coup? These military governments have restricted press freedom, postponed elections, and committed human rights violations. They're pursuing power, not purely liberation. But their success reveals something about French policy. Looking at the broader pattern, of the 23 successful coups in Africa since 2000, 16 occurred in former French colonies. That's geographical concentration. Roughly 70% of coups in roughly 25% of African countries indicates systematic problems, not random governance failures. In September 2023, these countries formalized their resistance through the Alliance of Sahel States, explicitly described as against neocolonialism and anti-French in outlook. Mass protests accompanied government positions. Thousands in Niger marching towards the French embassy. Crowds in Burkina Faso burning French flags. Not government-organized demonstrations. Popular sentiment that French military presence failed to provide security while maintaining economic arrangements that extracted wealth. What connects these three myths? Each obscures systematic patterns by framing them as isolated events or random chaos. Economic arrangements get presented as aid despite extraction. Military intervention gets framed as stabilization despite increasing violence. Coordinated resistance gets dismissed as simple corruption. France maintains its interventions prevented complete jihadist takeover. Possibly true. Military governments manipulate anti-French sentiment for legitimacy. Definitely true. Both points matter, but neither addresses the fundamental question. Why do policies designed to help consistently generate resistance? The evidence suggests French involvement systematically prioritized external interests, resource access, migration control, geopolitical influence over domestic development in partner countries. Here's what makes it systematic. Operation Persil wasn't one bad decision in 1958. The CFA Franc arrangements continue today. Military interventions from the 1960s through 2023 followed similar patterns. When policies fail for 60 years across multiple countries, that's not accident. The Sahel crisis isn't an anomaly requiring external management. It's the outcome of relationships never designed to produce genuine sovereignty or self-sustaining development. Whether these new military governments will deliver better results remain uncertain. Early signs aren't promising. Violence continues, democratic freedoms contract, economic challenges persist. But the pattern of resistance itself reveals something important. The relationship between France and its former colonies faces a legitimacy crisis that military force and economic leverage can't resolve. The question isn't whether these particular coup leaders deserve support. It's whether we'll analyze African politics through myths that serve external interests, or through understanding documented patterns that drive genuine political change, even when that change looks messy and uncertain, because the coup belt isn't random chaos. It's the geography where post-colonial arrangements are being rejected, violently, imperfectly, but systematically.